Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. I'm going to help you set up your Alpha 6100 camera. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to press the center button in the control wheel on the back of the camera to select my language. And then we're going to set the area, date and time. Just going to move that over to Melbourne and Sydney because that's where I'm currently recording this movie, and then press the center button again. Now we're working in daylight savings at the moment, so I'm just going to switch that to on. I'm going to set the date and time format here. So we're on the 30th of the month, so I'm just going to roll down because it'll be quicker to get to that 30 there. And then again rolling down because we're in October here. 2019 is correct, and the time is currently 10:47. So again I'm just going to roll down, and this is a 24-hour clock, so I've changed my mind. I'm going to roll up 10:47. So we'll just quickly roll that up and press the enter button when I get there. Okay, now you've got a choice of day, month, year, or month, day, year. So typically outside of the USA we use the day, month, year, and so I'm going to select that as well. And then I'm going to come down and select the enter. Very important that you don't forget the enter, otherwise you'll be doing all of this one more time. And yes, I'm aware that there is an Imaging Edge application that I can use on my smartphone, so I'll select OK. Okay, so now we're coming into the camera system. Now the first thing I'm going to do is put a memory card. We can see that it's flashing no card, and I've also made sure I've attached a lens so that all of the menu options are going to be available to me. Now I've inserted one of Sony's SD-XC cards. I've chosen a fast one, a category 10 card, so that when I'm shooting 4K movies, it's going to have plenty of speed. My preferred size is a 64 gigabyte card there. Okay, so first thing we're going to hit the menu button now. And we're going to come into the very first camera setup menu. Now if you're a JPEG shooter, because you're not quite ready to start processing raw files, you're going to leave that there. But what I would invite you to do is to come down to JPEG quality and switch that to extra fine. This gives you a more robust file, so if you are interested in editing that file through some post-production software, that is going to stand up to that editing a little bit more than using just fine. Now image size, we're going to choose the maximum 24 megapixels, and the aspect ratio is the full frame of the sensor. Now if at any time you do want to start switching to the RAW to edit, you can either select RAW and JPEG, so you get one of each. The JPEG is obviously processed by the camera. The RAW you're going to have to process in post-production software. Now I'm a RAW shooter, so I'm going to switch that over to RAW now. And moving forward, we're going to come over to the second menu. I just press the right side of the control wheel on the back of the camera. Long exposure noise reduction, I'm going to leave that to on. Now what will happen is if you use a long exposure, maybe the camera's on a tripod, and use a 10-second exposure with a neutral density filter to smooth water, the camera will take the 10-second exposure and then process the image for another 10 seconds to make sure that the noise is handled sensibly, i.e. we're not going to get an overly noisy image with lots of colored warm pixels they're referred to. Now the color space, sRGB is a really good space, especially for JPEG shooters who want to share their images to the internet. If you're more interested in printing your images out, you may want to switch this out to Adobe RGB. Just remember, in your post-production editing software you will need to convert that to sRGB if you're then sharing to social media. If you're using a high street printing lab that's nothing too fancy, again you might want to leave that to sRGB. If you're a RAW shooter, it doesn't really matter which you select here, because you're going to have a bigger color gamut in the raw files, so that really doesn't require changing. Lens compensations, I just leave these all onto auto. And then I'm going to hit the menu button to come back out of that and move along to page 3. Now you'll see some options that are grayed out, and they're grayed out because I'm a RAW shooter. So I'll cover that maybe in a separate movie. I'm just going to cover the menu items that are accessible for both RAW and JPEG shooters. Now the drive mode. Now we can actually select the drive mode on the back of the camera. Now we will have choices between shooting in single shooting and the drive mode for continuous shooting if we're shooting action sports. Now typically high would be my default. I'll only use a slower speed if the movement is unfolding quite slowly. We do have a slower speed still called low. We also have a high plus setting. This is where the camera is going to shoot at its maximum frame rate of 11 frames per second, but really it's not suitable for panning the camera because we're not getting a completely live view to the finder and monitor in high plus. So if you're intending to pan a quickly moving subject, I would come down to the high, which is the default, by the way. If you're looking to do a selfie with the camera on a tripod as a group family setting, you might want to use the self timer here. But as I said, all of these you don't have to access from the menu. You can access them from the left side of the control wheel on the back of the camera. So again, I'm just going to leave that in single shooting mode for now. And we're coming down to the bracket settings. Now the dynamic range of this camera is very, very good, and so you probably don't want to bracket a lot. If you're finding that you're working with some extremely bright highlights and some very dark shadows and you're prepared to post-produce the images, then you may want to just put the self timer during bracket to on. And so you just get a 2-second delay before the image takes the 3, 5 or 9 images that you want to bracket. And I'll come back into the menus there. Interval shooting function. You can sort of set this up now. This camera is capable of shooting stills that you can make into time-lapse movies using Sony's Imaging Edge application. There is a way of making time-lapse movies directly in the camera by turning the shoot mode dial on the top of the camera to S and Q. But if you're wanting to do this in post-production, you'll probably want to come into the interval shooting function. I won't switch it on now because I don't want to make a time-lapse now, but typically the shoot start time 1 second is appropriate. Shooting interval 3 seconds, that's also appropriate. Number of shots, I would start by maybe making that a little bit, increase the number of frames, maybe to 250 shots. This will give you a sizable a time-lapse movie. It will take, giving you an interval there of how long it will take to shoot this time-lapse movie, taking one shot every 3 seconds, and that's going to be 12 minutes in order to record this. The movie will play back much faster, so you're basically accelerating real time. So I'm just going to hit the enter there. And then we're going to come back out of the menu. So when I do choose to switch the interval timer on, I've got some starting settings there that I can use pretty much straight away. There is a second menu here, and that is to use silent shooting in interval. This makes sure that when we are shooting time-lapse, we're not using the mechanical shutter, we're using the electronic shutter. So we're not going to wear out the shutter of our camera by taking thousands and thousands of shots. I'm going to come back over to the menu here. So we're going to carry on going through onto page 4. We'll talk about memories maybe in a separate movie. It is possible to save groups of camera settings and access them from the MR setting on the top of the shoot mode dial. So you don't have to continually change 5, 6, 7 settings when you're changing from landscape maybe to action. We can just choose the memory and then bring up a group of settings we've already saved. And again, we'll do that in a separate movie. So focus mode. Now automatic AF, I'm not a big fan of automatic AF. So typically what the camera is supposed to do is switch between single shot AF, which is suitable for stationary subjects and where we're stationary as well, so it locks onto the subject. The camera will usually make a beep to say it's found the focus, or the other very common one is to use AFC, which is continuous autofocus for when your subject or you yourself are moving. Now this camera is very good in continuous autofocus, and sometimes the camera doesn't automatically switch. It doesn't detect that the subject is moving and so stays in single, which is a bit of an error. I would prefer, and this is my preference, is to set the camera up to work in continuous most of the time, and ever so occasionally when maybe shooting landscapes, switch that to single shot. So I'm going to advise you to switch that to continuous AF. I'll press the center button to select that, and then again I'll press the menu button to come back out into the menus. Focus area wide. I actually think this is a very good starting point. There is, however, another wide option, and this is something where we can track moving subjects. So what I would advise you to do, and it's at the bottom of the list, but we can actually roll up instead and come down to the tracking options. This is one of the significant improvements of the A6100 over the A6000 camera. So you can choose expand flexible spot. The camera will pick up a spot and then you can move that around. I typically let the camera choose the subject by just going down to wide. So we're just going to roll through all of the tracking options until we get to wide, and we'll select that. Okay, so now we have that selected as tracking wide, and I'll come back into the menus. Now we can change that later, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a custom key so we can change the focus area very quickly without having to come into the menus at all. Okay, AF illuminator, I'll leave that to auto. The face IAF set. Now this is going to be on by default and selected to humans. We do have the option of changing this to animals, and I'm going to again, instead of coming into the menus to make that switch, I'm going to make that as an accessible item in the function menu, which is 12 groups of settings, or 12 individual settings we can get to just by pressing the FN key on the back of the camera. So again, avoiding having to come back into the main menus. Now I just leave the right left eye or select set to auto, and face frame display is on. Basically you'll get a grey box around a face when it sees a face. Okay, and that's the same with animal IAF as well. Autofocus with shutter. Now this is on by default, and unless you're a back button AF user where you use a separate key for instigating when the camera focuses, you're basically disengaging it from the shutter release, then you're going to leave this to on. Now there is no significant advantages to using back button autofocus on these Sony cameras, so unless you're already used to using back button autofocus, I would leave that off your menu of things to do. Now pre-AF is on this camera. Now on the vast majority of Alpha cameras it is actually off by default. Now pre-AF is when the camera will always be focusing when you're pointing it at the subject. Sounds like a good idea, but when you're using stills photography for action sports, the camera will acquire a subject before you even give it permission to start focusing on something. And that means that if you've acquired the wrong subject, you're going to have to cancel and then reacquire. It's, as I said, it's a good setting to be left on if you're doing selfies and group portraits with your timer delay, but not really a great option for stills. I would prefer to switch this to the off position by default. And I have blogged about that particular issue with these cameras before. I would prefer Sony to have chosen off by default. And if you are doing selfies, just come into the menu and switch that back to on. Now on page 6 of the camera setup, we have iStart AF, that is grayed out, that is not IAF. This is to do with older Alpha lenses, and typically this will be grayed out until you attach one of those A-mount lenses via a lens adapter. So we're not going to look at any of these options. They're not really super important to set up this camera, so we're just going to move along to the page 7. The exposure compensation, we can access exposure compensation by pressing the down button on the control wheel on the back of the camera. ISO is set to auto, and this is my favorite setting. The only time I come out of ISO auto, and I would typically select 100, is when I'm choosing to do landscape photography on a tripod. So we'll just come back out. Another reason I might choose to a specific ISO is when using flash photography. Metering mode, multi, this is by far and away the most reliable way of getting accurately exposed images on these cameras. There are a couple of other options. I don't really recommend spot unless you understand the implications of this. Putting a spot on a subject is quite time consuming, and unless you put it on the right tonal value, you're going to get some surprises in your exposure. So we'll just leave that to multi and come back out. Face priority in multimeter basically means that if it finds a face, it's going to adjust the exposure slightly so we get the best possible exposure for that face, which will help if there's some backlighting behind the person you're photographing. I'm going to leave the exposure steps as they are, and auto exposure lock with shutter as that is as well. Page 8, we're going to leave the flash mode as fill flash, and there's nothing else to select here. You do have a red eye reduction. Typically I do try to use off-camera flash. If this is something that you're having hassles with by using the little pop-up flash, then you can come and switch that to the on position. White balance, I'm going to leave that to auto as well. Typically, if you're very fussy about white balance, you may, especially if you're a JPEG shooter or you're shooting movies, you might set a custom white balance. But at all of the times, especially if you're a RAW shooter, there's no problems with leaving that to auto. Priority set in auto white balance, we'll just leave that. The derange optimizer, this is a way of lightening the shadows when we're shooting movies so they're not overly dark. It also is very good for JPEGs. It does not get applied to the RAW files. Same with the creative style. Is if you come into the creative styles, you can modify the contrast, saturation, sharpness, but these are not applied to RAW. If you are a RAW shooter and you're finding the finder or monitor a little bit contrasty, you could drop the contrast here. But if you're looking for creating JPEGs with a little bit of punch, you might just leave this as is. Another reason to drop the contrast is if you're shooting movies in sunny conditions and there is quite a lot of contrast and probably excessive contrast for shooting movies, and you might want to control the contrast here now. So I'm going to leave that at 0 and come back out of this creative style. Just remember DRO, creative style, they're for JPEGs and movies, but not for RAW. The following two are grayed out because they're not available to RAW shooters. Now we are going to look at the focus assist. If you ever do have to use manual focus and you're trying to make sure that everything is sharp, the MF assist to on is a very useful feature, and it is on by default. There is something called peaking, and this is a way of the camera highlighting high contrast edges with a color of your choosing. Now it's off by default and I don't use it for stills, but if you are manual focusing in movies, you might want to switch this on, and then you can choose your peaking color. A lot of people don't choose white, they will often use a red or yellow color. So I'm going to set that to red, even though I'm not intending to use it right now. And now we're coming over to the last page on the first camera setup menu, face registration. It is possible to register a face of a family member, maybe at an event, and have the camera in a group of people find the face that it's been registered and focus on that one. This is great for making sure that your family members are always in focus and everyone else is not as important. And you can actually, once you've got multiple faces, you can change the priority. So if you were shooting a wedding, maybe the priority would be bride number 1, groom number 2, mother of the bride number 3, etc., etc. You can do this smile shutter as well. I actually don't like using this one. This is will delay the shutter until you get a big smile from somebody. Here's your self-portrait timer, which is on by default. and that means that if you flip up the screen so that it's facing yourself, you're going to get a countdown, so you know when to put the perfect pout on, so the camera will take just when you're ready. Okay, second camera setup is ideally just working with the movies now. So we got file format XAVC SHD. This is 1080 high definition movies. Now there is a 4K option. So if you're looking to do the maximum quality resolution because you've got a 4K TV, you may want to switch this over to 4K. Now the record setting will actually depend on the region. If the camera is typically set up for NTSC in North America, and will shoot at 24, 30 and 60 frames per second. In a PAL region, you're going to be shooting at 25 or 50. Now the 50 is not available in 4K, and the 60 frames per second is not available in 4K. Now typically if you're wanting to get the maximum quality from the movies and you don't mind the file size being quite large, you are going to choose the one with the larger number second. That means it's less compressed and it's more robust to post-production editing again. Now if you are looking to do some movies that you can maybe slow down a bit, you are going to switch that out to HD and then choose the faster frame rate. And again, you can see here we can choose 100 frames per second, and if you play this back at 25 frames per second, the movie is going to play back at a quarter of the speed. Now this would be 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second if you're working in an NTSC region. It is possible to switch the camera over if you're traveling with the camera, and one of the reasons that we have these different frame rates is that you are going to get a little bit of flickering when you're recording in fluorescent lights, where the power frequencies of different countries will lead to some flickering if you're not careful with your shutter speed settings. Now we do have the S and Q settings here. Now these are accessible, so without coming into this menu to record whether we want to shoot with a high frame rate or not, we can actually just set up and here I'm going to the let's just go back out, and we're choosing the record setting, the 25 frames per second at the higher bit depth there, and now we're going to come over to the S and Q, and the S and Q just allows us to set either we can record at 1 frame per second, so this is the way we create a time-lapse movie in camera, or we can shoot at 100 frames per second, and this will play back at a quarter of the speed, so everything will slow down so it's playing out in very slow motion. And so rather than coming into the menus to toggle between whether you want the frame rate to be fast or slow, you can just leave the movie on the shoot mode dial for your standard frame rate, 25 or 30 frames per second, and then just move the shoot mode dial on the top of the camera to S and Q when we want to do some slow motion movies. Now typically I leave proxy recording to off. This is sometimes useful if you're creating 4K movies and your computer is struggling dealing with the big file sizes. You can create a proxy. It does cause a few issues with IAF when we're shooting movies. So if you're having trouble with IAF in movies, then switch the proxy recording to off. And again, we'll just come over onto page 2. The AF drive speed, when we move the focus, and we can use the touch screen for this, we can choose whether to move the focus slowly, so and that is typically what I would consider as a standard. But if you're shooting maybe a fast music video with a fast beat, you may want to switch that to fast. I'm going to leave mine at slow because I want it to pull focus between 2 points very gradually. Okay, AF tracking sensitivity, I'll leave that at standard, and I'll leave the auto slow shutter speed on, and the initial focus magnification if we do need to go in. Now you can set that as 4 times if you don't want to have to press a button twice in to do that. Audio recording is on by default and we'll leave that on. Audio level display, you definitely want to see your audio levels because you might need to lower the audio level if it's a little bit too high. The wind noise reduction, leave that off. The sound quality takes a dive very rapidly if we just leave that on by default. And we're going to leave the marker displays all off. Now, if you don't like pressing that little red button on the side of the camera to start and stop movies, I would invite you to start and stop the movies using the shutter release, which is a lot easier to access. So I'm going to leave that on. Silent shooting, you should only really use silent shooting if you're working in natural ambient light. It can have problems if you're shooting with artificial lights such as fluorescent tubes, etc. And it also has a problem with shutter distortion if you're shooting fast moving action. So this should be off by default. There are quite a few things that don't work when silent shooting are on as well, such as bulb mode. When we're doing exposures over 30 seconds, you can't use that in silent shooting mode. E-front curtain shutter, that's an electronic front curtain shutter, and a mechanical rear curtain. That is best left on most of the time. If you're using non-Sony flash and you're having a little bit of problem, then you may want to Google this issue, because if sometimes you may need to switch the E-front curtain shutter off if you're using a non-Sony flash. And sometimes with non-Sony lenses at very high shutter speeds can also create a few issues. But for most Sony users using Sony gear, it just stays on all of the time. Okay, so if you ever find that you've taken several images and you don't actually have a memory card in the camera, you might want to release without card and disable that so that you can't take pictures if you don't have a card in the camera. Steady shot is on by default, and that's the steady shot of the lens. The cameras don't actually have steady shot inside. Okay, so these are both grayed out, and we'll just come over into the page 6 of this menu. Display button. Okay, so you can actually choose what will be displayed. Now, I can't demonstrate the finder because I'm not looking through the finder, so I'll just demonstrate what's on the monitor here. You can, if you want to add or delete some of the displays, you can uncheck here. So for instance, if I don't use this view, I can uncheck it, and then I would need to come down to the enter. Now, I actually quite like that view, so I'm going to leave that on. Just remember, if you do make any changes, hit the enter button to make sure that is programmed in. Now, in order to cycle through your displays, you just press the display button on the top of the control wheel, and this will cycle through your chosen displays. Okay, this is just with the important information at the bottom of the screen, and now with the histogram view, and now with the for finder view. This is when you don't need to see the image on the back of the camera because you're only using the finder. You can access a lot of the camera settings in this view simply by pressing the FN button and then cycling around and changing any of those values. Now, I'll go back to my preferred view, which is the one with the histogram in there, and then we'll press the menu to come back in. Now, zebra settings, if you are using a zebra setting for stills, my preference would be to set the level to a custom value, and let's just go to custom 1, and I would set that to the maximum amount, which I think is 109. Let's just check that. Yeah, it's 109. Typically this will just warn you of overexposure and to give you an idea that you really need to think about protecting your highlights by using exposure compensation, just lowering the exposure slightly so the highlights aren't overcooked, if you like. Now, I have to say that zebra settings are mostly used by for shooting videos, and this is when you might choose a lower value such as 70 or 80. This is where you pitch your highlight values, not that they're overexposed, but showing you that the highlights are being correctly exposed. But for a still shooter, I typically just use that custom 109. So let's go back into the menu. Grid lines, which will help you frame things up. I typically leave those off. and live view display. This is where you get live depth of field preview. The camera also shows you a live view to show you whether you're overexposing or underexposing, because the view will look too dark or too light. This is one of the primary advantages of using a mirrorless camera, so that is usually left on for 99% of the time. If you do find yourself shooting in a studio with some studio flash gear, you will probably need to switch this to off. Otherwise the camera will preview the dark studio without the flash, and so you won't be able to see your subject to focus and frame. Auto review, I don't like to see auto review, especially when you're shooting action sports. You don't want to see the images popping up every time you've taken an image. So you are able to press the review button on the back of the camera. So I'm typically going to switch that to off. And then on page 8, this is where we can set up custom keys. Now, and we can also set up custom keys for stills and have them do different things when we're shooting movies. Now we have a C1 key near the shutter release, and we have a C2 key, which is the trash can. Remember, it's only the trash can when we're actually reviewing images. When we're not reviewing images, we're taking images. That is a custom key we can use to get access to a frequently used setting that we want to modify without having to go into the menus. And the other thing that we want to do is access our favorite 12 menus here. And again, I'm going to do this in a separate movie. A lot of the 12 defaults here can be accessed from the camera directly using hard controls. The drive mode is on the left side of the control wheel. We've got the focus mode, which you may want to leave. We've got focus area. Typically I change focus area quite a lot, so I want to program this to a custom key. So you might leave that now until we've done that. Exposure compensation is accessible on the camera by pressing the down button of the control wheel. ISO we can access from the right side. Metering mode we very rarely change out of multi, so again that is slightly superfluous. We do have a mode there which I leave in place. There's a silent shooting, which you will occasionally want to switch on. Here's my creative style. If I'm shooting a movie and I want to lower the contrast, I can access there. There's my white balance and flash compensation. I tend to use flash compensation on the flash. So this is another setting that I tend to change in this function menu. And as I said, I'll deal with that in a separate movie. So we'll go back to the menu. I'm going to leave these two as their standard settings and come over to the final page. The movie button, yes, we'll leave that as always taking movies. The dial wheel lock, we're going to leave that in the unlock position, and the audio signals on. If the beeping of the camera in single shooting mode is annoying people around you, just remember you can switch that off. This is where we can set up our Wi-Fi settings and Bluetooth settings for the camera, and you can link that to a remote, a Bluetooth remote sold by Sony, and so we can do all of that work in here. So this is our playback mode, and you can decide to set a rating. Okay, so the rating, when we're rating images, we can rate the images whilst reviewing them by setting up a custom key. And typically if we're rating an image, we're going to be able to set up a star rating. Now this star rating is respected by some post-production software such as Lightroom. Typically I don't want to use all of the star ratings, so I would remove the 3, 4 and 5 just so that I can decide what are my good images and what are my best images, and I can quickly locate that after I've imported them into the computer, and I'll hit the enter there. We've got the continuous playback for interval. This is where we can review interval timer images, so we can get an idea of what the time-lapse movie would look like if we're actually shooting the stills on the camera, and the playback speed. I'm going to leave those as a standard. So one of the things that we can do if we're using this camera to shoot action is display as group, which is on by default. And then display rotation, let's just go in and check that, is we can leave that onto manual or off. And image jump setting, which is something that I do want to do, is select the dial wheel, and then the image jump method. I can go one by one, or I can go by my rating settings, so I only see my rating images if I use the dial wheel to review my images. So let's go back into the menus, and now we have typically I will actually adjust monitor brightness if I'm working out in the field on a very bright day. I'll set my monitor brightness certainly a little bit brighter, but there is also a sunny weather setting. Okay, so this won't be grayed out on your camera, so you can actually do this. You have to look through the viewfinder, set the monitor brightness. So if you find the actual view through the finder is just a little bit dim, you can actually make that a little bit brighter. Here are the volume settings for the camera. So if the camera beeping at you is a little bit loud, just to lower the volume. Now we're going to leave the tile menu off. If you need a little bit of assistance in choosing appropriate menus, you might want to switch that on. And if you're wanting a little bit of help when you're choosing, as you change the shoot mode dial from say aperture priority or auto to shutter priority or manual, if you want some idea of why you're doing that, just leave that to on. I'm fairly familiar with what is happening there, so I'm going to put that to off. So let's just move through, delete, confirm. I'll have cancel first so I don't accidentally delete an image. Display quality, let's just go back, display quality. I can set that to high. Power save start time. I don't want the camera switching off and going to sleep too prematurely. Sometimes there is more than a minute between my shots, so I might just set that up to 5 minutes before the camera or powers down. Auto power off temperature if you're doing so a lot of 4K movies and you're trying to get the maximum recording before the camera and sensor gets too hot to record, you might want to set that to high. It also helps to just pull out the monitor window a little bit so that a little bit more heat can escape from the back of the camera. This is where if you're in a NTSC recording region, say the USA, but you're holidaying in maybe Europe or Australia, this is where you could set the camera from NTSC to PAL and then return to NTSC when you go back home. Now there is a reformatting of card in order to do this, so you don't want any images that you haven't downloaded on that card when you do that. There is a cleaning mode for the sensor, but typically the best sort of cleaning you can do is maybe one of those Giotto rocket blowers. If you have been changing lenses and it's been a little bit dusty outside, you really want to get in the habit of blowing out the camera each time you return home. So touch operation, this is currently on. When I'm shooting stills, I actually don't like the touch operation on. I would actually switch that to off. Now I'm going to switch that on when I start recording movies, so I'm going to put that in my FN menu so I can quickly turn that on when I need it, but I don't leave it on all of the time. Some people on the forum say, why is my spot focus point always in the bottom right hand corner of the screen? And that's because they put the camera to their eye, their nose has touched the monitor, and the focus point has moved to the bottom right hand corner. So if you find yourself doing that, switch the touch operation to off. It's a great feature for changing focus or tracking subjects when we're actually shooting, but not for general use. Okay, so let's move over to page 4. There's my language setup if I was selling that to somebody whose English wasn't their first language. There's my dates time setup that we started this movie with. Area setting, again we did that at the beginning of the movie. Now this one menu item is something that you will be coming back to the menus to find. Now because we can't put this in the function menu and there is no hard copy control on the camera to be able to format the memory card. It is good practice after you've downloaded all of your images to format the card every time. But one exception to that rule is if you haven't quite filled the card and you want to put as many images on the card as possible and keep that as one of your backups when traveling, you possibly will only format when you clear the complete card. So we'll leave the file number on series and we'll move over to the last page. This is where you can just display the media info about your SD card. This is where you can check the version of the camera. Periodically, Sony will make available new firmware updates. You will need to connect the camera to the computer in order to do this. If you ever find your camera is really not happy for one reason, you can reset this camera. Now, camera settings reset will often preserve any shoot mode memories you record. Initialize is a deeper reset, and this will prepare the camera as if it is a brand new camera and remove every setting that you've done on the camera. I'll just come out of there. Final menu is if you struggle to remember where things are kept. This is where we can actually add the items to My Menu. So you don't actually have to remember that it was on page 2 of the second camera setup. You can just add items here. So let's just add one. Let's just add maybe one towards the back end, which was the format option. So instead of having to remember that it was on page 5 of the setup menu, we can just add the format my card to My Menu. Okay, and so let's just come back out. Let's just switch come out of the menus and then go back into the menus, and you can see this will always appear there for you to access quickly. And you can add quite a number of your favorite menu settings to this one. So when people say all the menu systems are quite complex on a Sony camera, you just say, no, I've put them all in my FN menu and in My Menu, and I know where all of those are, so I never actually go into the rest of the menu system anymore because my camera is set up, and that's primarily probably why you're watching this movie. So thanks for listening. Just remember to head over to www.markgaylor.com. All of the learning resources that I create for the Sony Alpha community are free. If they have proved very useful to you, just consider making a small donation through the PayPal link you will find. And just also remember to subscribe to this channel because I'm making quite a few movies that will support all Alpha users. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.